Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to have you here. I'm Betsy Cantwell. I'm the Senior Research Officer at the University of Arizona, and I am completely delighted to introduce Mary Rigdon to you. And I'm going to talk about what she does first and then tell you a little bit about her. Despite what you think or what you've heard, there is no gender competitiveness gap. And I am here to represent on the female side. It's a myth that women are not as competitive as men. The truth is that men and women think differently. Isn't that amazing? And are equally competitive, but motivated differently. So Mary Rigdon is going to talk to us about this gap and really making the case for business and in the way that we ethically approach the world that we live in. For greater inclusion, equity, and opportunity to place women in higher level roles where they belong, frankly. So Mary Rigdon is the director for the Arizona Center for the Philosophy of Freedom, which is an amazing center that focuses on really the true philosophy of freedom. And she's an associate professor in political economy and moral sciences. Her research on gender competitiveness and wage gaps has been widely published. I have a long list here, but I'm not going to read that to you. I do highly recommend looking at some of the critical work that she's developed and put together. She's sought after internationally. She is really a recognized expert on gender equity, and I think that her perspective and the perspective of her scholarship on this gap in what motivates is really important for the national discussion. So Mary, if you are there.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for that introduction, Betsy. I really appreciate it. Thanks to all of you for coming. How about this Wonder House? Isn't it absolutely incredible? I want to say thank you to everybody who made this possible, who made this happen. I also need to thank the National Science Foundation's Decision, Risk, and Management Sciences, Economics, and also the Science of Broadening Participation for funding the research that I'll be sharing with you today. So conventional wisdom, or at least half a century of deeply ingrained norms, tells us that this stubborn wage gap persists in part because of women ourselves. We don't negotiate higher salaries. We fail to ask for pay raises that we deserve. We don't apply for promotions even when we're fully qualified for bigger and better gigs. And we also are less likely to enter competitive and male-dominated fields that pay well. So women are less competitive than men, and in fact, 10% of Fortune 500 CEOs are women. This is actually a record high this year. So women are less competitive than men, and as a result, the wage gap can in part be explained by the competitiveness gap, and also explain why it persists, right? Well, my colleague, Alessandra Casar, she's the professor of economics at the University of San Francisco, and she's also the director of the Economics Lab Without Borders, and I weren't buying it. What I want to do today is set out to change our perceptions about women, about competitiveness, and about the wage gap and why it persists. So the pesky wage gap. The latest wage data shows that women earn 83 cents for every dollar that's paid to a man. This is for full-time yearly workers who are white women compared to white men. It's even worse for women of color. Women of color earn Black women earn 67 cents for every dollar. Hispanic or Latina women earn 57 cents for every dollar. It's estimated that women, on average, as a group, we lose over $513 billion in lost wages every year because of the gap. Average working women over their lifetime lose about 530,000. I had to think of the number, it's so large. $530,000 in lost wages because of this gap. For highly educated women, it's even more. It's nearly $800,000 over the lifetime. So this wage gap translates into less money, less income for families, and it also means that working women have less retirement income when they finish working. You can also look at this over time. So you can look at how the wage gap has changed over time. So this is by year, and that's the proportion that women are earning relative to men. So when I was born, I'll admit it, over here, women were earning 64 cents for every dollar. I remember I had a first grade teacher. She wore a t-shirt that said, "You owe me an additional 36 cents." But you can notice here what happens in the 80s and 90s. The gap actually started closing relatively rapidly. Yay, that's encouraging, right? Women were getting more education. And actually, it turns out men's wages were falling a little bit during this time. So it was sort of this combined effect. Where are we today? This is in the last 10 to 15 years. The wage gap is stalling. Many people are very concerned about the fact that this number has not varied much in the last 10 to 15 years. It's pretty much 80 cents. We get up to 85 cents on the dollar. So if we want, in fact, for Asian women, this is another statistic, for Asian women, it'll take 24 years for them to close the wage gap with a white man. For white women, it's 44 years. For black women, it's 100 years. For Hispanic or Latino women, it's 200 years. That's 2210. Right? So at this current rate, those are some pretty big numbers about how long it will be for women to close this wage gap. So if we want to close it, we are going to need to better understand why it occurs. Why is it persisting? And if it's the result of women ourselves just not being competitive, we don't have a taste for competition, can I ask you, what are the solutions? What do they look like? So one, and I know this will be familiar to women, we're told just lean in, right? And I do just because, at least growing up in my household, just meant exactly not that, right? We'll just remodel the kitchen. We'll just remodel the bathroom. My favorite project of all was we'll just strip the paint off the doors and the door jambs of this 200-year-old house, right? So just lean in. Or two, if it's the result of women expressing their natural preferences, look, hey, we just don't have a taste for competition, then maybe we actually don't need to close the gap at all. Both of those are garbage choices. Alessandra and I say, women are as competitive as men if we know how to look for it. So how are we going to measure competitiveness? I'd like to ask you to please take out your phone. This is a short survey. Oh, someone's already on it. You go to minty.com and the code, I'm sure you can see it, it's 34728185. It's going to ask you some questions about yourself and then, surprise, some questions about competition. It is self-paced, so go ahead and answer all the questions. We'll start seeing your responses here. Cue the Jeopardy music, somebody, can we? Is everybody doing okay on the survey? Okay. Anybody still working? A couple of you? Okay, we'll wait another minute. everybody's still looking at their phone, so I don't know if that means you're checking your email now or you're still working on the survey, texting your friends. Are we ready to move forward? So this is interesting, I think. Typically in a survey, we try to get equal representation between men and women. What you've just taken, the survey that you just completed, is a shorter version of a way that we measure competitiveness with survey questions. So we'll talk a little bit about your data here. I'm really interested to see it. We've been looking forward to seeing your data. So I asked you what your education level is. We are highly educated, yes? Right? Only 13% have some college or no degree. Then I asked you, I enjoy competing. So the male here is in blue and the female is in pink. Sorry for the gender stereotype of colors, but actually it helps you think about the data a little bit. So we're actually a very high, so typically, this is interesting. So typically what we see is these numbers down here, right? Women tend to say that they are somewhat disagree or even strongly disagree with that they enjoy competing, but I wondered if we might actually see a highly competitive group in here. That's awesome. I'm good at it. Interesting. So it's only the males? Two males down here. So again, typically what we see about the I'm good at competing is very high pink bars over here and very high blue bars over here, right? Again, I wondered if we would have a self-selection in this group. I was so looking forward to your data. I often try to outperform others. That's awesome. This is not typical. Competition brings out the best in me. Interesting. So it's so interesting because so many of you said you enjoy it, you're good at it. But then a few of you are showing up over here saying it really doesn't seem to bring out the best in you. You somewhat agree, lots of you somewhat agree that it does. So what researchers do with respondents' answers to these questions is they create a competitiveness index for an individual that tries to capture and summarize your answers to these questions. Women typically, on average, not this group, score lower on this competitiveness index. So that means they say they enjoy competing less, they're not as good at it, and it really doesn't bring out the best in them. There are some real issues with measuring competitiveness this way, though. There's a thing called response bias, which basically says respondents don't provide truthful answers. Why? They might be trying to provide the socially acceptable answer as people are observing their data. This could be a particular problem with this survey where there are these gender norms around competitiveness. But it's also the case that it isn't really clear when I'm asking you these questions what kind of competition you're thinking about. Right? What kinds of competition? That's why I asked you that question. This was actually an experiment. I wasn't sure what we would see. So some are combining types of competition, right? Work, sports, so like maybe soccer or pickleball. Anybody in here play pickleball? Work, performance, sales. This is interesting, right? In this highly educated group, you're thinking about it from an academic standpoint, how I do in school, right? How I do in classes, business. Ooh, achieve outcomes, I like that one. Gaming, so that's another question, right? Are you thinking about other types of games, maybe like chess or Go, something like that? So we aren't really sure what type of competition you're thinking about when you're answering these questions, as you can see from here. So what I want to ask is, how can we get a true measure of competitiveness that doesn't rely on people's judgments about how good they are at it or how much they enjoy it? We bring participants to our lab. They tend to be college students. Why? Well, at the University of Arizona, there are nearly 40,000 of them. So we have an ample subject pool. They're also really good participants. They're diligent about reading the instructions and asking questions. And we're going to pay them based on the decisions that they make in the experiment. And we don't have to pay them that much money, right? We can pay them a reasonable amount, and they feel like we're paying them a lot of money. So I'll give you an example. We aim to cover their opportunity cost of coming to spend time with us in the lab. So that's the next best alternative they could be doing with their time. Undergraduates sometimes tell me that that's sleep. But we think of it as it could be an alternative job, right? The work that you would be doing for a company. So what we want to do is at least pay them the minimum wage and do a little better than that because we want them to come back. So our subjects on average will make between $25 and $50 an hour, just to give you an example of how much they earn. What we do is we're actually going to create a labor market in the lab. So let me tell you a little bit about that. Welcome to the Decision in Economic Sciences Lab. I'm Mary Rigdon. Thanks for coming to participate in this experiment today. We appreciate your time. We're going to go through the instructions together, and you'll have a chance to ask any questions. So if you have any questions at all, please raise your hand. What we do is we present a real effort task. We'll give you this real effort task. What your task is to sum these, find the two numbers that sum to 10. I've given you an example. I've solved it for you. Here's 4.81 plus 5.19. That's 10. So that would be a correct answer, and you'd want to click Next to confirm that answer. You're going to have 2 minutes to solve as many of these as possible. Notice the clock is ticking in the corner. It'll be keeping track of how much time you have left. So again, your task is to solve as many of these as possible. And we'll have 3 rounds where what we're going to do is vary the payment scheme across those 3 rounds. And then in the final round, what we'll do is we'll choose one of these randomly for the cash payment that we'll give you at the end of the experiment. Okay, any questions? Round 1, how round 1 will work is every participant here will get $2 for every numbers problem, or we call them matrix problems, you solve. Every one of you, for every one you solve, you'll get $2 for solving that problem. So notice how many I solve, how much I earn, doesn't impact anything that happens with you, right? So Teo, let's say you solve 4 matrices, and you solve 3. How much money would you earn, Teo, if you solved 4? You get $2 for every one. Yeah, $8 exactly, right? And I think you solved 3. That was great. We want to be sure, we've got to do comprehension checks, right? Make sure your subjects know. So you solved 3, so how much money would you earn? $3, or 3 matrices times the $2, right? So you would earn $6. Yep. So we call this payment piece rate. So for every matrix that you solve, you will get $2 for sure. It's a sure thing. Okay, so that's round 1. Round 2, we're going to ask you to solve it again. We're going to give you this matrix search task or this real effort task again. But this time we're going to pair you into groups of 4. And only the top 2 performers are going to get paid. The bottom 2 performers will earn 0. We're going to double the incentive, so now it's going to be $4 for every matrix problem that you solve, but only if you're one of the top 2 performers. If we call you low performers, if you're one of the low performers, you earn 0. Okay? So should we walk through an example? So imagine you solve 10, and you solve 10. And you solve, how many do you think you're going to solve? 2. And you, how many matrices do you think you'd solve? 4, okay. So how would this payment work? If there's one person who solved 2, one person who solved 4, and you each solved 10, what happens? Remember, we doubled the incentive. You get $40, the 2 of you, for winning this competition, and the others earn, 0, right, for their work. Exactly. Okay, so we call this a tournament. And notice, what other people are doing in this task impacts your other people's payment. One more thing I just want to add here, which is you learn how many matrices you've solved at the end of this round, and we actually we ask you to guess your rank. So we say to you, do you think you're 1, 2, 3, or 4? And we'll give you a little bit of money. We always incentivize things when we can for being right. Okay, so you would now be asked to guess your rank, and you'd be paid if you get it right. We're trying to measure confidence here. Round 3 comes up. We're going to ask you to do this one more time. I know we're the worst, sorry. Last round, you'll solve this one last time, but this time you're going to get a choice. You've been through the 2 payment schemes, the piece rate and the tournament, and now we're asking you, do you want to choose to be paid for your performance in this round by the sure thing that you saw in round 1? I'm going to get $2 for every matrix that I solve, for sure. Or no, I want to compete. I think I have a sense of what this group would look like. Do you want to be paid $4, double the incentive for every matrix problem that you solve, or 0 if you're one of the low performers, right? One of the 2 low performers. You get a choice. So you've had the experience of both types of mechanisms. You know how many you've solved in each case, and you get a choice. So we call this entering competition. People who select this payment scheme, we say, you're choosing to enter a competition. This is how we're measuring competitiveness. You're basically telling me, the experimenter, that you prefer to compete over getting a sure thing. Okay? So now we can ask a question, which is, what percentage of men will choose to enter the tournament? And also, of course, what percentage of women will choose to enter the tournament? Do I have any armchair economists who want to propose a hypothesis about what the data might look like? You want to just see the data? Sure. Interesting. So did everybody hear her? She said no significant differences between gender. Interesting. All right. Anybody else have a different hypothesis? Aha. Did you say you think men will pick the safer one? Oh, you said, yeah, I couldn't quite hear you over the noise out there. You think you're going to see more men over here, more women over there. Anybody think the opposite? Oh, you think the opposite. Okay, so all hypotheses are on the table. That's what I love about research. That's great. Okay, well, how about some data? Men, 50% of men, so this is their entry decisions. This is in round 3, choosing to compete. Men, 50% choose to enter the tournament. That means 50% chose the safe option. What about women? This is about 35% of women choose to enter the competition, which is a significantly lower number than men. So more women are choosing the safe option. But I thought I was saying women are just as competitive as men, but this looks like data that suggests women are less competitive than men, right? And that has been the conclusion with this data until now. So Alessandra and I started asking, what if women are just as competitive as men, but they exhibit it in different contexts? Rather than a lower desire to compete, women are motivated by different incentives as a reflection of their cultural and biological constraints. Look, we know there are hidden costs to women who compete and win. Turns out, did you know men generally prefer women who are less ambitious than they are? Women who get promoted to high executive positions and win political victories, did you know they experience higher divorce rates? Not so for men. So there are these hidden costs to competing, and women seem to know this at some level, to the point that even highly accomplished, highly educated women, talking about Harvard MBAs here, choose to strategically downplay their economic aspirations when they know that those preferences can be observed by high-quality bachelors. So there are definitely, these are just a few. I could be up here all day telling you about the hidden costs. And women do seem to perceive these hidden costs to competing and winning. So Alessandra and I think that the reason we're seeing the gender differences in competitiveness, the data I showed you, is a result of the tournament incentive itself. It's a one-dimensional, money-only payoff. So we think that women will reveal their natural tendency to be competitive with a different type of incentive, a socially oriented reward. So what does it mean for an incentive to have a social dimension? Well, let me show you some of the incentives we've been working with and studying. So we replaced the money-only payoff with now you get a book voucher for children's books. Instead of a money-only payoff, you get prizes like beauty gifts, fashion items considered acceptable things to female interests. This is joint work with Michalis Druvalis at the University of Birmingham. In addition to the money that you earn in the experiment, you have the opportunity to make a donation to a charity of your choice. Finally, in the research I want to talk about today, the social dimension is very simple. At the end of the competition, a winner is given the option to share some portion of their earnings with one of the low performers. So we keep the monetary value of the incentive exactly the same. We just add this option at the end to share with one of the low performers. So some of you might recognize that what we've done is replace this money-only payoff with what we actually call a dictator game of the same value. So this is this ability to divide this resource following competition. We know a lot about data in dictator games, and so this is a natural starting point. We started to think, maybe this will motivate women. We often get asked, how did we come up with this experimental design? So I was talking to Alessandra one Saturday morning, and she was taking her two girls to a soccer game. And she was lamenting she had spent all morning in the kitchen chopping up oranges into these little slices. And I said, well, you're out in San Francisco, it's hot, like these young kids, they need those during the game. And she interrupted me, and she said, no, Mary, it's not it's not while they're on the pitch. What we do is at the end of the game, the two teams come together onto the field, and the winning team, we hope that's us, the winning team is going to share this kind of gift with the losing team. I said, well, that's really interesting. I said, do boys do that? And she said, well, I only have girls. I don't have kids. So I asked my husband, who's a competitive soccer player since young, Do boys do this? The response was quick. Anyone want to guess what it was? Hell no. Except he didn't say hell, he said a different four-letter word. Like, this is just not in the realm. So we started to think maybe this will motivate women to compete. And there's actually research in evolutionary psychology about this. At a very young age, I mean really early in childhood, boys love games where you win, and they're clear losers. They like rough and tumble fighting. They like games where they can strive to be in a dominant position. Girls, at a very young age, what do we choose? They tend to be more cooperative in nature, but they certainly don't have clear winners and losers in the same way. So we started to think about adding this social dimension, this opportunity to share as a result of this. So we can ask, what happens to the rates of entry? What happens to the percentage of women now who will choose the tournament with this social incentive? Also, we might care about what happens to men's entry decisions too, right? Any hypotheses in the armchair? Should I just show you the data? I'm reminding you of what it was before, where we had the gender competitiveness gap in the money-only payoff. The data is going to come up over here. I'll start with men, because you're not as interesting. I don't mean that, really. But it is a funny thing that this is exactly the same rate of entry into the tournament with the social incentive as it was under the money-only payoff. And something that's been really funny and interesting as we've done more and more of these experiments is it's really hard to change men's behavior. It's about 50%, like no matter what kind of incentive to the tournament we run with them. Women, on the other hand, are highly sensitive to the social context, right? So here, this is, I have to see, 65%. So that is statistically higher than this number, right? But also importantly, that gap has closed. The gender competitiveness gap has closed under social incentives. Okay, so there we have it. The option to share closes the gender competitiveness gap. Women want to share, and so great, we're done, job done. I guess we can go get a drink at the bar. So a question for you. How many of you think that women will be more generous than men? Just by a show of hands, I see somebody say, will be more generous than men. So when given the option to share, they'll share more. So it's a weak 50% of you, I would say. Did I hear something? No, okay. Okay, so let me show you men. When given the option to share, men share about 15% of their earnings. I hear the guys laughing. That's not very generous, okay? So, those of you who raised your hand, and me, we're predicting that we're going to see a higher bar for women, right? Okay. 15%, exactly the same percent of what they share as the men do when given the option. Okay, so it seems it's the option to share that motivates women to compete. I mean, look, they're just not generous when given the opportunity to share. So it's the option to share that seems to motivate women to compete. And I will tell you, this was a surprise to Alessandra and me. We really thought that women would be more generous, especially because we know in the standard dictator game, right? This is just a dictator game after the competition. We know women are more generous in that game. They do share more with an anonymous recipient. So we really had the expectation that we would see this red bar be much higher than the blue bar. So guess what that means? We have more questions, right? So there's more need for more research. And we're currently working on our next set of experiments now, designing them to try to figure out what is it about this social incentive, this option to share, that motivates women to compete? Is it something like, I want to have the ability to divide these resources? Is it something about repairing post-competition, maybe bad feelings with the losers? Is it just having the option to share gives you some sort of nice perception about yourself when you're competing? Or maybe it's a perception that others have of you? And so we really do have some unanswered questions about why this particular incentive motivates women. And it's great. This is one of the reasons why I love to do empirical research. I said I've been doing this 25 years, and I think I've never not been surprised by at least one result, right? And so this was definitely surprising to us. Based on our research, the World Economic Forum's 2022 report included as one of the ways to close, it was only 15 strategies, to close the gender wage gap, was we needed more research to better understand what motivates women to compete. But this should be enough information to debunk the myths about women in the workplace. Women are not less competitive than men. They're just motivated differently. Look, perceived competitiveness is highly correlated with a lot of other valuable attributes, like being achievement-oriented, being determined, being innovative. Maybe you even might think being a good leader. So if we mistakenly think women are less competitive than men, guess what? We might also be mistakenly perceiving women to be less achievement-oriented, less determined, less innovative, and less able to be a good leader. You know, one question is could this actually help explain why women entrepreneurs have such a hard time finding venture capital funding? Did you know women-led startups receive 2.3% of venture capital funding? Maybe we're misperceiving women as less innovative. Could it be part of the explanation for why women now make up 60% of the workforce? Do you know what percentage they make up of leadership? 35%. Maybe we're misperceiving women that they can't be a good or effective leader. So it really is time to change our perceptions and know that women are as competitive as men. They just are motivated by a different type of incentive. And so finally, I'll come back to the whole lean in idea. So Sheryl Sandberg, in her famous, now almost infamous book, right, of this same title, what did she do? She told women, what? That we could lean in, right? That's the title of her book. That we could have it all, basically, right? But we needed to just change what? Well, we needed to change our approach to negotiations. We need to change our approach to our job. And we need to be a better advocate for ourselves. So Alexandra and I are all for female empowerment, but we have some pretty serious concerns with these particular strategies for women. First, it isn't clear it works. Michelle Obama, in an interview in 2018, said, "It's not enough to just lean in. And she said it, stuff doesn't work." In fact, there's recent research that actually suggests it's worse than that women who pick up these strategies and try to use them in the workforce experience backlash from their employers. Two, I think this is probably worse, is that it does place the blame squarely on women. It tells women, and really the rest of us, that it's the problem of women, that the gender wage gap is existing because of women's own thinking and women's own behavior. If that's our approach, right, if that's our thinking, then there's no real reason to think about making any fundamental changes. Remember, if it's just about women ourselves, it's up to women. Right? So our research suggests a novel policy tool that might be implemented to increase women's representation in competitive environments include socially oriented incentives. So this could be implemented by having labor contracts institute, maybe let's say an option for sharing a bonus across teams. That's just one example. And that might be something that would encourage women to compete. With a reward system that gets perceived as sort of a shared one, rather than one that's disproportionately benefiting those in the corporate suite, it might actually encourage women to exhibit their natural tendency to be competitive. But it's time to change the system, not the women. Thank you. And I know I heard there's someone coming around with mics for questions. I've been waiting for this part. I'm so interested to hear your questions. Yeah, so right there.
You talked about how you did a lot of studies with college students. I was curious, how does if you know from your studies, how is competitiveness different between age groups?
Great question. So actually, these experiments have been run with young kids, and it happens at a very early age, at least in the United States. So this gap exists between young boys and young girls as young as like 5 years old. So you see it with this particular tournament incentive, where it's this money-only payoff. There is a gap, and it happens at a very young age. We haven't had the luxury to run ours with young kids, which is something that I would absolutely love to do, to find out if maybe young girls are even sensitive to this social dimension at an early age, given that we know that they choose and select games that are different from what boys select. It could be really interesting to look at what happens with young kids. Yeah, no, thank you for your question. Oh, I think Mike, she's coming.
What was the sample size for some of your experiments? Were they large sample sizes or small?
That's a great question. So the work that I talked about today, so the question, did everybody hear it, was about sample sizes? So this is actually across 3 groups of college students. We ran these on Zoom, believe it or not, during the pandemic, where they would come to the lab and they would turn on their cameras. And so we have roughly 200 of men and women of each type in the social incentives. Right. So there's definite power there. Yeah, no, good. Thanks for the question. Okay. You already have the mic, yeah.
How do you account for any survey biases that you may have, right? And in a data set, how much of that can be accounted for answering things under, social norms or what's expected?
So here, the only kinds of survey questions we asked them was about their gender. And then we asked them a little bit about do they like to take risks, but we actually incentivize that. We get their risk preference measure. So we don't actually, in our work, do much with surveys, partly because we are concerned that, they're not an incentivized instrument, and we know that incentives matter. And so that's partly why we want to run the experiments that we do, is because you can get a true measure. Like, this is a labor market. You're getting paid for the performance, for your effort, for solving these problems, and we can very easily control how you're being paid, and we can know then how you're responding to competition as a result. Yeah, great question.
I have the mic too. I guess that gives me power, right?
And influence.
So thinking about the cultural differences, not the gender differences. Are you able to account for any of this by the history of the subjects?
Oh, that's a great question. I was going to answer that a little differently. So we know that our populations here have been Western, educated, they're from industrialized countries, we're rich, and we're democratic. So there's this wonderful work by Joe Heinrich that we're called weird subjects, is actually what we call our subjects. It's not very nice, but that's the title that he gave them, that looks at cultural differences. And so one really nice study that looked at this, using this particular tournament, is some work by Uri Gnesi and John List, where they looked at matrilineal and patrilineal societies. Any hypotheses? One was in Tanzania, one was in India. So they had very similar characteristics, but the only difference was their cultural history of sort of who's the boss. Any guess? I mean, the patrilineal societies look just like this. You know, the data I showed you with the money-only payoff, where women are far less likely to enter the tournament than men. Matrilineal society, way higher entry rate, to the point that it's actually higher than the patrilineal entry rate by men, which I think is a pretty astounding result. So that definitely is work that's been done trying to look for cultural differences and how that might make a difference to behavior. That's a pretty powerful result. Yeah, thanks for your question.
Yeah, somehow it's related to that previous question. Do you have any data about women of color here in the US? And I'm particularly interested in Latinas and African Americans.
I need your help to run those studies. U of A, let's run those studies because it's something that, like, most of our subjects, I mean, I would say if you look at the race breakdown, it's not very diverse. And so it's a really important question, especially because, you know, we know the differences in the wage gap affect them so much more. And so it's a really terrific question that I don't have an answer for that I really wish I did. There are a lot of communities we'd really like to study. You know, there's another one that we'd like to study, which is to go to Iceland. I have a friend who was born in Reykjavik, and I keep telling her we need to go to Iceland because why? Why might that be interesting? They're one of the most gender equitable places in the world. And so it'd be really interesting to see, you know, it'd be similar to the matrilineal, patrilineal kind of thing. Maybe having this experience over time where it's more culturally accepted that we are equals, that might make a very big difference to people. We haven't even run the baseline with them, you know, the baseline money-only tournament. So it's on the list. Thanks to the National Science Foundation again.
I also have the mic. Hi, thank you so much for your talk.
Thank
so you
you.
mentioned policy reform as kind of a consequence of your research, but I was wondering what other examples of practical application you might have for some of the work that you've done.
Yeah, this is a great question. So since we're still trying to figure out why this social incentive matters, you know, I showed you all those different social incentives where these results replicate, right, under all these different types of social incentives. But we aren't quite sure why yet it motivates women to compete. And so that really is our next set of treatments. And until I really completely understand why it motivates women to compete, I always, you know, say with a grain of salt, I don't want to say that, but, you know, just to be careful about that. I do think including socially oriented rewards is one possibility, and I would absolutely love to do an experiment in a firm where you can have some people who get that option and the other people who don't, so that we could then actually have more to say policy-wise. But I can say, so I was on a pre-call for a women's equity in sport panel that I organized for Arizona that's coming up in April. And so we had Sarah Spain and Catherine Bertine, who's CEO of Homestretch Foundation. She's a U of A alum. She was instrumental in getting the Tour de Femmes cycling tournament. And we had Catherine Switzer, who's the first woman to run the Boston Marathon. And we asked them, you know, what's one message you want to be sure comes out of this? And they said, we need allies. We need people, and not just women. We need men and other people, like people who will be willing to try to affect change as well. It can't just be on us. So I would say finding allies, finding people who will care about this, trying to close the wage gap, given that it's stuck. Does that answer that?
So piggybacking on your question, I wonder, I would love to talk to you later because I'm fascinated by this.
Terrific.
My company is actually funded using like all of these principles. And what's different about us is that I built it out of intrapreneurship within an organization that existed already and was looking for new ideas from within it and was willing to spin things off. And I don't know how many organizations are actually following an intrapreneurship rather than a venture or an entrepreneurship model. But as a first-time founder and entrepreneur, it was a really accessible and scalable way to build a business that is not only socially focused, but has these social rewards built into it. So that might be an interesting model to look
Terrific.
at.
What's your company?
Campus Sonar.
Campus Sonar.
Yeah.
Terrific. That's fantastic. And yes, we can all meet at the bar when we're done with questions. So I will be over there. I've been waiting to have fun at the Wonder House. Anything else? If not, I will say thank you so much for coming. Enjoy the rest of your stay here. Thank you.